Now deep thoughts.
Wow, that's pretty deep.
Deep?
Hey guys, this is Deep Thoughts, a podcast that explores the Christian faith a little more deeply. This is really strange. I'm not normally the host of a podcast, and I'm not the host. But we have Pastor Matt, and we are celebrating something, aren't we, Pastor Matt?
It is. We are 100th episode, everybody.
This is amazing.
100 episodes.
This is very exciting.
Incredible. And this is Jordan Esau,
Hi.
who helped me start the podcast.
Yeah.
I looked this up today because I didn't know. 2019. We started the podcast 2019. I don't know how many episodes you were around for.
I'd probably say 30-ish, maybe.
Yeah.
I mean, 100 episodes in 6 years. I'm not sure. Like, you're going pretty slow, actually. I think.
Very slow. It's like a very occasional when I feel like it podcast.
Oh, that's awesome.
I know. There's people who are like very from what I've been told is this is pretty funny. If for a podcast to be successful, you need to hammer out one a week, like all the time. Like you just need to be consistent, always doing it. And I have the opposite approach. I'm like, I do none for 3 months, and then I do 3 in 6 weeks, and then I take a break again.
I wonder though if you wouldn't get a little bit of listener fatigue, right? I sometimes find that though when there's like, oh, there's new stuff every single week, right? You get a little bit of listener fatigue. So
who knows?
It's kind of nice to.
I do it for fun.
Yes. So I got a couple questions for you. Like, what would be one of your like all-time favorite guests that you've had on the show, apart from me now, right?
Okay, before we get into that,
Okay.
I just want to talk about starting this thing with you.
Sure.
Because we have this fancy little setup now, and we were just talking before we started.
We are in very different digs.
Where there was no video before.
Yeah.
True podcast. 2019, and we were in like, you had an office that was essentially like a boiler room.
It was an electrical room.
Room.
Yeah, it smelled of ozone and electrical panels, and
true.
It was awesome. And we would gather around a little table, and I'd set up little desktop microphones, and we just used what we had in the cupboards, basically, at the church here.
Yeah.
And that was a very humble roots, for sure.
Very humble roots. Season 1, we started it with seasons.
Yeah.
Season 1 was, we did a sermon series called Doubt in 2019, which was looking at the key faith questions. Like Barna Research had done some stuff. Like, these are the 6-7 questions that essentially younger Christians are asking right now. And we did a sermon series about those things. And tried to talk about how there is a place for doubt, and we can bring our big questions and talked about those. So why is there evil and suffering in the world? Doesn't science refute the Bible, prove it to be untrue, that kind of stuff? Hypocrisy, isn't Christianity a fairy tale? And so we had all those sermons, and I thought, like, okay, this is actually a great place to start a podcast. Yeah. Like, this is really important stuff. So I spun those into 25-minute episodes or something like that.
Let's dig a little deeper. Like, what are some of the topics that we can talk about a little bit more outside of just Sunday morning, right? And unpack them a little bit more. Yeah.
Yes. And then I would take my iPhone, and I had this little microphone I would clip on. I would let Emily hear the episode, and then she would give her, it was a segment we called Final Thoughts.
Yes.
Where essentially it turned into her just,
pits.
Many people miss Emily not being on the podcast. She doesn't want to have anything to do with it. She gets bored of things and moves on.
That was deep.
This is very exciting because this is the very first installment of a segment that we are calling Final Thoughts. Mm-hmm. And it is with my wife, Emily Shantz.
Yeah.
So you just heard the episode. We want to hear your final thoughts.
Okay. Right out of the gate, there's something that I need to get off my chest that's pertinent. The overuse of the term alongside in Christian culture. In your little podcast, you only said it once, maybe twice, but it sort of reminded me that this is something I wanted to talk about for some time.
Okay.
So I just want to get that out right away. I think I like the concept of what alongside means. I think we can kind of come up with some other ways to communicate that principle without saying alongside all the time
Okay.
because I can't handle it anymore.
So what I hear you saying is that you don't think that we should come alongside doubters.
Okay, so if I was doubting and you came alongside me, as you say, I used air quotes for the listener, I don't think I would like how that feels because I don't like how it sounds. So let's begin there. That was kind of...
That's a bonus. That's just free.
That is not even the final thought. That's just a little sprinkle of something personal that I've wanted to share.
And so she would essentially, it turned into her just like roasting me mainly.
I think I got a few laughs out of a couple of her comments where, yeah.
Some of her like content on like Christianese jargon is
legendary.
legendary.
I think still one of my favorite little bits that she pulled out was come alongside. Like, what does that even mean, right? I literally always actually think every time I hear that Christianese term, and I think of like ships, and I'm like, what are we actually saying with this, right? And I definitely identify with Emily.
Each other and doing life together.
We are alongside each other right now.
We are.
It's great.
We are. It's incredible. So that was really funny. And then we started season 2 was like I started asking guests.
Yeah.
That was either people in our church. It was sometimes I'd read a book and was like really valued somebody's voice and thought, well, they're great on this.
Yeah.
And that the concept of deep thoughts eventually kind of evolved to I wanted to talk to people literally about their deepest thoughts, like their best work, and just get them like sharing their wheelhouse stuff with us. And so it became a pretty neat project for me there because I got essentially to talk to a bunch of my heroes, which is fun.
Well, and that's why it took so long to get to me, right?
That's right.
I don't have a whole lot of deep thoughts, but no. So I guess that leads us to the question. Who would be one of like your all-time like guests that was like your just absolute favorite? If you could talk to them again and again and again, who would you ask on?
Yeah, that's super fun. Like there are two, I mean, so many, but there are two that like rise to the top for me. Yeah. One of them was essentially the hero of a younger Matt Shantz, and one of them is like more of a present hero. Okay. So I got to.
I have an idea. Okay. I'm not going to say their names because I'm just curious because I don't want to spoil it and be like, oh yeah, I didn't think of them. But the
younger Matt Shantz's mind would have been blown if he knew that I would get to talk to Martin Smith.
Yes. Okay.
From Delirious.
That was one of my names. Yeah.
I went to like Delirious concerts, which were essentially just beautiful worship nights, like 6 of them maybe.
Oh wow.
I was a worship leader as a younger person, and like I can't tell you how thousands of hours I would say, like just singing Delirious songs. I just like they were formational to me, and so getting to talk to him about writing songs for a generation, his influence is huge on today. Like the biggest artists today would like so many of them trace back to like Martin Smith's influence. Hey Martin, thanks for coming on my podcast.
Thank you for having me. This is amazing.
Well, it's amazing for me because I don't want to be too over the top here, but I honestly don't think I would be in ministry if it wasn't for you. So you inspired me by what you were able to express in Delirious songs. So Martin, God has used you in my life and thousands of people. So I'm thousands of miles away in suburban Canada, and God used you to really have an impact on my life. So thank you, my friend.
Amazing. Well, really appreciate that. Thank you.
So getting to talk to him about worship in the church and songwriting, and then the record label actually gave us permission to play.
I remember that you tell me
tracks.
Oh, we can actually use. They gave us permission to use more of this.
So we would talk about like Obsession, one of his songs, or I could sing of Your Love Forever, Did You Feel the Mountains Tremble, and the song would come in. So that was like super fun.
Yeah,
that was really
fun.
Cool.
I remember that episode in particular as like somebody who was kind of like behind the scenes and like getting to record and do some stuff like that. That was definitely probably one of my absolute favorites was just being a fly on the wall, listening to you guys' conversation. And it was just like, I can't believe my lead pastor is getting to talk to like my boyhood idol. Like that was still even to this day, his music is just is wonderful.
And he was so
very, very
gracious and kind, and that was amazing.
Yeah.
And then the other was very recent, Matt Chandler.
Oh, okay.
So Matt Chandler is like, I think like he's a big preaching influence on me, especially from years ago when I became a preacher. Matt Chandler, this is amazing for me. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
No, listen, I'm glad to be here, bro. I think it's amazing for me.
There you go. You get to talk to a Canadian pastor today, Matt. Come on.
And I'm in Texas. We didn't even know there were Canadian pastors. The people who know me from the Texans are going to be like, wait, what? I keep trying to tell them that the kingdom of God is global.
I would argue there's nobody living who does better application to our context from the Word of God than Matt Chandler.
Wow.
Like, it's just so on point. It's so, he's so observing of people's hearts and trends, and just speaks God's word powerfully, I think prophetically, into people's lives. And so again, getting to talk to him was probably with those guys was the most like, don't be an embarrassing fanboy to Martin Smith or to Matt Chandler, because everything in me was just like, this is the greatest. This is the greatest.
Yeah, totally.
I love these guys so much.
Very cool.
So pretty great excuse getting to talk to those guys, and both of them. Like, Matt Chandler was incredible. Like, he was just saying, like, let's connect. Like, we got to come up to Canada. Let's talk.
Yeah,
and,
very cool.
Hey, I want to send you these documents, like, on these things about church planting campuses. And I was like, wow, incredible. So
I do got to say,
legit.
that is actually one thing that has always struck me about most of the people that you've had on your podcast. It's usually like the offline conversation after. It's like, put aside, the quote unquote celebrity part of it, and they're just very like down to earth, humble people who just want to see God's people equipped, and like there's just like, hey, let's get together sometime. Let's the offline stuff is just so warm-hearted and encouraging. So I love that.
I'm with you. Like, I agree. Like, it's really cool. Just that has consistently been the thing. I've just been so encouraged by. These are men and women in ministry who really have like, I mean, they're talking to like a little podcast up in Canada. There's a really gracious posture to them.
Yeah, totally.
And they're just like happy to do it and want to serve God and people. And it's been sweet.
That's very cool. Okay, so other guests that you've had on, like, so slightly different question here, but what would be like the one that a guest or two that really made you the most nervous, where you're like, I don't know how this is going to go. Like, okay, let's wade into these waters. Who would that be for you?
I can trace this down to a singular guest.
Okay.
I mean, like, there's always a little bit of that, especially because there's most of the time not a lot of relationship there, and you're like, how is this going to go? There's a little bit of butterflies. Yeah. But Dr. Nancy Piercy is by
I remember
far
this one. Yeah.
Like, just and I got to have her on twice, and but she just, and it was all me. There was nothing that she was doing, but her book Total Truth is like this dense manifesto of like all domains are God's domains, and this is what faith looks like in these spaces. She's written a ton of great stuff.
Hi, Dr. Piercy. Thanks for this conversation today.
Thank you for having me on your show. Appreciate it.
And I want to say thanks as well, because a couple years ago, our pastoral team at our church worked our way through Total Truth together. And it really was illuminating and revolutionary for us in a number of ways. So thank you for that great book.
Well, that's great to hear. I'm glad that you're working through books like that. That's a good sign when a church is working through books on Christian worldview. I don't think that's very common.
But she's absolutely, definitively like an intellectual, a scholar, an intellectual.
Totally.
And, feeling a little bit out of my...
Well, it's at least from my standpoint, it certainly didn't come across that way. I would definitely put you in that category as well. So take that as encouragement.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that. When asking her what her favorite color was, I was able to like go a little deeper. I was like,
totally. Yeah.
But yeah, and then funnily enough, the second time I had her on, we'd started to do a video element to these podcasts, and I forgot. I was still doing them in my office with like GoPro cameras on my desk, and I forgot to press record.
Oh no.
So thankfully the audio was there.
Yeah.
But I like to like
I wasn't around for that one.
Stuff.
I wasn't around for that one, Matt. I'm sorry.
It was probably part of the impetus to be like, can I be around people who know how to press record, and let's do this better.
I'm glad I didn't forget to press record.
So I went ahead, probably having those feelings around Dr. Piercy is part of the reason I forgot to press record on those videos. But yeah, no, very intimidating, but no reason that she gave off. She was wonderful.
Yeah. Any repeat guests? Like who would be like your favorite kind of repeat guest?
Yes, and there's some that we have plans to bring back on, but Nancy Piercy did 2.
Yep.
Joshua Ryan Butler did a couple.
Yeah.
We have a few. Jason Kovacs was the first guy to do 2.
Okay.
And then I can't think of, I'm blanking on his name. A professor from Biola. What's his name? He did 2, and we were joking around that if he comes on for a 3rd, I should send him some sort of a jacket like they do for the 5 Timers Club on SNL. Should send him like a robe, like a Deep Thoughts robe for being the 3 Timers Club.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
That would
like
be
some
fun. So,
we got to get some deep thoughts swag going.
We should.
Sweater.
We should. There'll be 4 people that would want it.
I would be one of them, I guess. Yeah.
And I'd give one to you.
Okay. So last question, like what would be like your absolute ultimate favorite moment on or something that just made you like face palm, or just like, oh, I can't believe we recorded that, or maybe your favorite part that didn't make an episode?
Oh, wow. Okay, there's some good questions there.
Sorry, I sprung that last one on you.
Well, I mean, funnily enough, like you said about like after the official interview, some of the great stuff just in the banter and conversations, like it has been fun to like often add a little blooper reel at the end of like funny little things, or needing to do some restarts, or just a funny conversation that came at the end or the beginning before we'd officially started the interview that we could add in, because a lot of fun stuff happens.
Yeah, I remember we did that in the very first season, and maybe 2 seasons. We would add that little teaser at the end where it was like just something little, like a little funny interaction. Yeah, I remember you would pull that out and we'd put it at the end. Yeah,
it's like a bit of levity, right? Like just trying to have some fun, and these moments would always come up. Like consistently, there'd be some good stuff to add there. Yeah. I think for like the moments that really I felt like something really matters here that we're doing. One was I was able to interview a couple Indigenous brothers in Christ and talk about history in Canada, the relationship of the church with the Indigenous community, what reconciliation could look like. Yeah. And that became an episode that I think was more important than I anticipated, and actually has been one of the most listened to episodes, and has kind of gotten a lot of listenership far and wide. I've heard a lot of feedback on that. It's Lord willing part of like a redemptive process there.
ACM Tanasiea, Itsapu Olial, Anta John, Deleitson Lakamel. And then I would like to say to those that are here on this land and want to journey well with the First Nation people with a good mind and a good heart. Mitsa Kutwilam Tana Tomuk, Haha Tomuk, Iamach Tomuk. Welcome to this beautiful land. Welcome to this sacred land given or made by the Creator to this beautiful land. Heitsapka. Thank you all.
Brian Dirksen lent his song that he wrote to that project, allowed us to use it. Wow. We got some news footage and Prime Minister Stephen Harper's speech in there to Parliament, seeking to bring reconciliation and apologize. And so that felt like an important episode. The other one on a very personal level was I interviewed my mother about medical assistance in dying, being a nurse, a practitioner, and working in palliative care for decades, and being at that time a terminal cancer patient herself, talking about the value of human life and interacting faith with death.
And I think about my dying as the same thing. I think about whatever suffering there may be ahead of me. It is time limited, and there's going to be joy on the other end, because I believe in the resurrection. I believe I will be with Christ. I believe I will be reunited with family and so on. I have hope.
Yeah, it was a beautiful episode.
It was a beautiful episode, and for me, just having guys like yourself who we were able to capture audio, and I have that of my mom, is personally very, very special.
Yeah, so. It's beautiful. It's a special thing for sure.
So thanks for helping me get this thing started, man. You were a big part of that, and really the creative process.
Well, and if you don't know, actually, in the very beginning intro music, like at the very little tail end, there's like somebody yells like, "Deep Thought, quick! Deep Thoughts is starting." That was me.
That's the guy.
And I yelled into my phone and it would record that.
It's
and
awesome,
I was like,
man.
hey, let's use it. Let's throw it in there.
I love the jingle. It's
Yes.
like this silly,
It was
like
so
hip hop
good. Yeah.
kind of thing, and then we
Wow, that's deep.
grab clips from like random people talking about something being deep, and you put that little jingle together, and I still love it so much.
Me too. Yeah, absolutely.
So thanks for being a part of all this.
No,
man.
thank you, Pastor Matt. It's been an absolute pleasure being part of it, and I pray that there's another 100 episodes more. So
within 6 years, I plan to do
6 years. Yeah, exactly. 200 episodes in 2032.
Yeah,
sounds great. Perfect.
Thanks, Jordan.
You're welcome. My pleasure, Matt.
All right. Well, every once in a while, I like to take some listener submitted questions, and without fail, you ask some doozies. So I've picked a few, and we'll try and get to as many as we can. This first one asks, where did Old Testament believers go when they died? And that's a really interesting question. I think that there's a lot of agreement on this. The simple answer, I would say, is they seem to have gone to the very same place that New Testament believers go. And the answer is heaven, or what's referred to as sometimes paradise, or even Abraham's bosom. And they're all language for the same thing, which is into the presence of God immediately. There are a few different views out there about like a sleeping state until the resurrection, but by and large, people believe that when they die, they go to heaven, right? The thief on the cross with Jesus, today you will be with me in paradise, Jesus responds. And we need to understand that in the Old Testament, though the people who would go to heaven were people of faith. In Romans chapter 3, Paul talks about the fact that God, in his divine forbearance, pass over former sins to show his righteousness at the time, so that he might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. So before Jesus died to pay the penalty for sins, it says that God essentially passed over those sins, making the place for the punishment of that death on his son Jesus, so that people could be forgiven. And so it was looking forward to that sacrifice, and they too would go to be in heaven. It's like the very next chapter is Romans chapter 4, where it talks about Abraham being saved, not by works, but by faith. It literally says, Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. So you could say Old Testament believers were ultimately saved by the cross, that God was waiting to put that punishment there. And those after the cross who put their faith in God are also saved, forgiven of their sins by what Jesus accomplished on the cross, and go to heaven. To make this just a little more complicated, when we say heaven, we're talking about what's sometimes referred to as an intermediate state. I'm not talking about purgatory or that concept at all, but just recognizing that we're still waiting for something. And that's Jesus is coming again in his resurrected body. His body was resurrected from the grave, the very thing we celebrate at Easter. And he's going to return bodily. And at that time, believers will be given resurrected bodies, and we will dwell with God in a new heaven and new earth. And so that's eternity in a biblical perspective. And so heaven now is the same thing it was for Old Testament believers, which is an intermediate state. It's in the presence of God, but awaiting resurrection, the bodily, physical new heaven, new earth. And so it's the same answer essentially for Old Testament believers as New Testament believers. All right, next question. It's a doozy, just warn you. The question is, what are your views on the old earth and young earth creationist perspectives? The questioner is specifically asking a bit more on the old earth creationism thing. I need to just start by saying, I need to set the record straight. There are legitimate, Jesus-loving, Bible-believing Christians who disagree on the answer to this question. there are a number of Christians who say, if you don't believe in young earth, then you're not a Christian. You don't believe the Bible, because it's being posited that it's so obvious in the scriptures that in 7 days, God made the earth, and that was 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. But there are a lot of other Christians who would say that's a particular reading of the Bible that we're not necessarily bound to. A few years ago, I had a gentleman want to meet with me at my church. He heard me quote Timothy Keller in a sermon, which I do about 1 out of 4 of my sermons. And he was very concerned because I had quoted Tim Keller, and in his mind, Tim Keller's a heretic because Tim Keller had said that he was essentially an old earth. He believed in the earth being perhaps billions of years old. And in this guy's mind, that guy's a heretic for that. He's not even a Christian. And you quoting him is a very dangerous thing to do. I pushed back a little on that and tried to have a theological, biblical conversation about how there's room for different views on this. And that was highly concerning to him. And he went on to leave the church. I think that this subject actually belongs in the realm of like eschatology, end times, what's going to happen in the end. There are different, and yet I would argue legitimate and rooted in the Bible views of interpretation of sometimes like pre-millennialist or amillennialist or post-millennialist. Like, when is all of this happening? I think we can actually disagree on this stuff and still be Christians and still believe the Bible. And so sometimes you might hear it said, like, look, Genesis isn't trying to be a science textbook. So we shouldn't, read into it with a 21st century Western mind. Like, hey, if I just map out what it's saying, like, look at this genealogy. It's saying the person, how many years they lived, then the next person, how many years they lived, all the way back to Adam. If we add those up, that's how old the earth is. That's a 21st century Western way of reading that. If you actually look back, we have, ancient like Mesopotamian genealogies and other ancient genealogies recorded historically. And something that's noted is entire generations completely skipped and left out. In the ancient world, they weren't trying to be precise. It wasn't their goal. That wasn't what they were trying to accomplish. So they'd leave out generations and amounts of time because being specific didn't matter to them. They were making another point. They were drawing out key individuals that they were wanting recorded and for their readers to know about. They weren't trying to actually give a timeline. And so we need to recognize a document in its context and recognize what it's trying to do. And then if I could just kind of show you here a couple interesting things that Genesis does that are worth noting. It says in Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then it says, the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. In the beginning, there seems to be something formed, a number of things formed, and yet there's a void. It's needing to be filled. And so the Spirit of God is hovering over what? The waters. What waters? Because it's only in verse 3 that God says, let there be light, and there was light, and God started to fill. And so, God always has been, always will be, is the same yesterday, today, and forever. The Ancient of Days. What was there? And was it formation to such a degree that that's some of the stuff that gets dated now, that goes back billions of years, that there's pretty broad scientific consensus on? Like, I can take that or leave that. I'm not too concerned about that. But it's also not problematic for me to hear that there's, pretty broad consensus among scientists that the universe is billions of years old. It doesn't trouble me. Because I'm just wondering, before we even get to what's created on day one, there's something there. I don't know what to do with that. And then it goes on to actually tell us that it's only day 4 that the sun, moon, and stars are created. And so a question that I have about that is like, well, how, like, so do we need to bind ourselves then to before the sun, moon, and stars that mark the daytime, that mark the nighttime, that marked the passing of time, day 4? Do we need to assume that days 1, 2, and 3 happened in 24-hour spans? And so all I'm positing here is I just see a lot of space for it could be this, it could be that. I think what's really important in this old earth, young earth creationist conversation is Christians recognize some incredibly important things. So with eschatology, we must agree as Christians that Jesus is coming again. When exactly? How exactly? What are all of the elements that are going to take place around that? We might be fuzzy on or even disagree on, but what we do agree on is Jesus is coming back. And in the same way, I think Christians need to recognize we believe that God made all things. He's the creator of all things. It's important for us to agree that God created and he made it good. There was a point where there was a sinlessness and a sin entering the world. God created humanity. I believe that God created Adam and Eve and that he did something particular in them he didn't do with any of the other creation, which is he put his imago Dei into them, the image of God impressed on them. And so, some old old creation folks, old earth people would say that they would follow a lot of evolution and say there's this evolutionary process, and then at a point God creates Adam and Eve or humanity and does the imago Dei thing at that point. And so there's a space there where Bible believing Christians go that route and others say no, it didn't, and so there's disagreement, and yet we need to agree that God did something unique with humanity in our creation, and it's image of God that's distinct. God made the world; He made it good. He's the creator of all things. Those are like big rock things we must agree on. When it comes to young Earth creationism, of course, it's this idea that God created the earth relatively recently, like 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. Typically with that comes literal 7 days of creation. Genealogies and mapping those is usually seen in a way that is adding up the time and giving us an idea there. Sometimes with some of the carbon dating and things going on that looks like things are much, much older than 6,000 to 10,000 years. There's a lot of young earth creationists would have arguments for that. They would say, yes, God makes, the trees, for example, but he doesn't make the trees. And if you cut it down, it would have no rings because it's 0 years old. Like, no, it would be like an aged tree, that the rock formations would be created like they have been established for a long period of time. And some old earth creationists are going to go, wait a minute, God isn't tricky like that. He's not pretending things are older than they are. God is truthful. But you could also say the same thing the other way and say, like, well, why is God mapping it or telling us the creation account in such a way that seems to read like this happened in sequence this way and in this amount of time and talking in days? And you have to wonder, is it supposed to be that allegorical or is it not? And so there's really questions both ways. But I get a lot of comfort from the fact that, Tremper Longman III is one of the greatest living Old Testament scholars. He would be an old earth creationist. N.T. Wright is considered one of the greatest New Testament scholars. He's an old earth creationist. Tim Keller, I mentioned. Michael Horton, a Reformed scholar, would hold the old earth view. And these are like people we should all look up to who are rich theologically, love Jesus and love the Word of God. And so I just believe there's a space for that. Interestingly, Augustine you were talking 4th century. He actually believed that Genesis was not literal 24-hour periods of time. So we've got like a 4th century, the greatest theologian of the early church saying, like, don't pin yourself down to 24-hour days. There's no reason that you need to read it that way. He literally said the periods of time are beyond the experience and knowledge of us mortal earthbound men, and therefore not to be understood as solar days. Origen, a church father, in the 2nd century, we're talking the 100s, held a more allegorical view of the creation days, suggesting they represent periods or stages rather than literal 24-hour days. And so this isn't some sort of modern, well, the science says, so we need to abandon everything in church history. Actually, church history says there's actually quite a lot of openness to how we interpret an ancient Hebrew document as 21st century Westerners. And so there's a sort of a long-winded way to say, look, for me, myself, this isn't problematic for me one way or the other. It doesn't make me nervous. It doesn't make me uncomfortable. Like the Bible's not accurate if it's an old earth. I have no problems either way. And it's just something I haven't even really given a ton of thought to because it doesn't cast doubt for me much. I think there's actually space for us to see. I pointed out just a couple small ones for us to read our Bibles in a super faithful way and hold these things loosely. Second question, also, or is this the third question? Third question, also quite a heavy one. The question is this: since Samson killed himself but was favored by God, is suicide a pardonable sin? I want to answer this in 2 parts, and I want to do this very sensitively and strive to do this wisely, because death by suicide is such a tragic and serious thing. And so I'm thankful for the question. It's an interesting question, and bringing Samson into it as a biblical example, I think is why I want to talk about this in 2 parts. So there's the Samson part, and then there's sort of the topic of death by suicide part. So first, when it comes to Samson, like I'm actually not sure we can derive much about suicide from it. We read in Judges that, his last act is he's pushing these pillars, these 2 pillars over, that then the roof caves in this Philistine temple and kills like thousands of people. And so is that a death by suicide, or is that, you could argue it's some sort of like final act of valor, like a soldier that knows that he's going to die, but he's going to fulfill the mission at the same time. I'd also say that the book of Judges is like super complex. If you read the book of Judges, it's not pointing out, wow, Israel are living out the ideal that they should be. It's actually one of like rebellion and unfaithfulness and Israel spiraling down, not being particularly faithful to God. And the interesting thing is Samson embodies those things. He has moments of faithfulness, but he is no great example to be followed, like many of the biblical characters. He is flawed. Although he is physically strong, he is morally not strong at all, actually. And so he is endowed with this special strength. He's this Nazarite. He's has these Nazarite vows. He's supposed to grow out his hair. He falls in love with a woman that he shouldn't fall in love with. Eventually, he tells his secret of his strength is in the length of his hair. Essentially, though, it's in actually the fulfillment of his Nazarite vows and living into those. And the cutting off of the hair, I think, is 2 things at once. Yes, it's the hair itself that's being cut, but it's also the breaking of the Nazarite vow. It's this moment of his unfaithfulness in what God had called him to do. He is not at all being faithful. His hair is cut. He loses his strength. He is imprisoned by the Philistines, the very people that essentially he had a mission to to save Israel from the Philistines. It was a task that God endowed him with extraordinary strength to do. He fails at it. They cut his hair. He loses his strength. They imprison him. They gouge out his eyes. They bind him. And then he has this moment where they bring him into this Philistine temple called the Temple of Dagon. And there's like 3,000 people there. There's some people on the roof, a crowd of people on the roof, crowd of people in the temple. And they're mocking him. They're bringing him in as a show. Look, we've overthrown the Israelites. Their strong man is bound. And in that moment, Samson prays to God that God would restore his strength one last time. And he pushes on these pillars and God restores his strength. And it's in some ways him fulfilling what he hadn't before in overthrowing the Philistines, these people that were really, really doing horrific things and were a threat to Israel. And in this kind of mixed, in the book of Judges, this mixed, messed up scenario, he has victory, but it feels like a complicated one. It's not neat and tidy and clean. He didn't necessarily need to kill people like that. He dies doing it. God honors his prayer for this strength in that moment, and so it's really kind of complicated. I just don't think, all of that said, that it's this very clean story that tells us almost anything about, in comparison to what we could glean about the topic of death by suicide from the Bible. Now, when it comes to that topic itself, I actually spoke to that question about death by suicide and whether it's like an unpardonable sin or not. I spoke to that in episode 80. So to just invite listeners, if you're interested, go back to episode 80 where I address that question specifically. And I just need to speak to the complexity of it. There's no clean answer. One thing I know for sure is that God draws near to the brokenhearted. And I know that people who are wrestling with or have suicidal ideation are in a really tough spot. And I would just say that God is one who cares for you. He's near to the brokenhearted. We need to be realistic about mental health, mental illness issues, and the amount that plays into suicidal ideation for many. There's complexity there. Of course, we're not meant to be the arbiters of death and life. God is supposed to be. And so we shouldn't play that role in deciding that we should take our own lives. We should live our lives, and God should be the one to give and take life. And yet, like I said, somebody's in a really tough place to even want that as like a way out. So in a really kind of crass way, yes, I think suicide is a sin because it's taking a life, your own life, in that only God should do that. But nowhere does Scripture seem to indicate that it's an unforgivable sin. The reason we ask that is because there's such finality to it. But where the Bible is clear is that those who put their trust in Jesus, like nothing can separate them. It's really dark times that get us to a place where we think that suicide would be the way. And I just empathize for anybody who has those kinds of wrestlings who may be listening. God loves you. God cares. There are other ways out of such desperation, and would just invite cries for help to be made towards the church, towards professionals who can be really helpful, medical practitioners, counselors, certainly. We will stand before God when each one of us passes away and be judged, either for our righteousness or unrighteousness, but ultimately for Christians, what we believe is the righteousness we're relying on, our own or Christ's. And when we rely on Christ, we want to live for God's glory and trust Him, even in the hardest of things. And so I want you to hear empathy. I want you to hear that there's complexity and nuance to something like this. And that if this is a space that you're in, please, please, please reach out to someone that you trust. Final question I think we have time for here is, how important and healthy do you think it is for a church to have small groups be intergenerational? How important is it to have groups in the church be intergenerational? I love this question. I think it's a great one. They're all good questions. Now, I think it's very important that groups in the church be intergenerational. I think there is a time and place for age and gender bracketed ministries, but I'd advocate for those being less than many of us think or default to. Affinity groups is such a thing in our society. It's like, hey, here's a gathering for young people. Here's a gathering for singles. Here's a gathering for women. Here's a gathering for men. Here's a seniors event. Here's a kids thing. And I think that there's a lot of good that can come from those very kind of age or gender bracketed ministries. There's a space for that. There's something really advantageous of, hey, everybody in the room is in this stage. This is their thing. And you can speak specifically to that, especially from a place of faith. I think that's excellent. That's great. I think there should be times for those. But what I don't love is that the general diet of gatherings of a church be segregating. I think the general diet and rhythms of a church should actually be the church gathered in all its diversity. Men and women, boys and girls, the old and the young, the singles and the married, those with kids and those without kids. Actually, that is the church. We're all of those things. And so I would actually advocate for, let's be really focused with the time that we sort of segregate into these affinity groups, and make their general diet our rounded gatherings. I think even small groups, life groups, community groups, like the small group midweek gathering that we do and advocate for, that as much as possible, those be as rounded as possible. I know scenarios where there's like small groups and they're all young families and they're all in the same boat and they're all exhausted and they're looking at each other like, does it ever get easier? Are we ever going to get out of this? Are we ever going to sleep again? Are we ever going to have sex? Is marriage always as hard as when we're not sleeping and have these kids that need us every minute of every day? It's just really like wise and beautiful to have some middle-aged and seniors in the room saying, hey, it does get better. That can actually say, hey, we've been there. Here's some wisdom for being in there. And also, let me just tell you, it gets easier, or it shifts, or new challenges come at the next stage. And people who can talk about those things, like really practically, but also in the faith. It's important that there be some events perhaps for everyone who's single, and singles can get together. And it's like, it's refreshing to be around other singles who get it. But at the same time, we don't want that to be exclusive. There needs to be moments where the singles can be in a small group and say, hey, here's what it's like from my vantage point. And that rounds the group. Or that couples can speak into the singles' life and vice versa. Like, those are really important. The generations, the spectrum of diversity is generally speaking really important for the church. In the Bible, there doesn't seem to be a lot of kind of breaking off. We don't see that a lot in the New Testament. It doesn't mean it's right or wrong. We just don't get a window into too much of that stuff. But we are told in 1 Timothy 5, hey, treat older men among you like fathers, treat younger men like brothers, treat older women like mothers and younger women like sisters. The church is a family. So that's talked about quite a bit in the New Testament. And it's expected that there's interaction there, and that kind of interaction is actually like really good in the life of the church and for the building up of our faith. Titus 2 talks about older men. It talks about older women teaching younger women. And so there has to be spaces where that happens. And so I think I would advocate for, hey, there's a space and time to do some bracketed, like affinity group type spaces. Let's get the men together and let's charge these men to as like husbands and fathers, or just males living for God's glory. Let's talk about what that looks like specifically to men. There's a space for that. But I think generally speaking, let's have the diversity together. Let's hear from each other, love one another, learn from each other, And I think that ultimately that rounds us and is what the church is about. And in a culture so affinity group driven, I think it's a beautiful apologetic, like witness to the world of the generations and classes and different groups all being together, having Jesus in common, and that it being this really, really unique, compelling society to the world. And so we don't want to be so affinity driven that we miss being that kind of a witness, which I think is really compelling in our moment, to be the family of God, and that be compelling to people who are lonely and wanting real family. I think the church has something wonderful to offer. And so that would be my word there. It's not really one or the other, but I think it's together more than segregated. So great questions. Let me just wrap this thing up. Thank you, listeners, all of you who've listened 100 episodes in. It's been a total joy and thrill for me to get to do this podcast. I want to thank Jordan for helping me get it started. I want to thank Landon and Andy, who do really great behind the scenes work to make these episodes happen. Just really thankful for those guys that get it in front of you, both with audio and with video. Thank you to everybody who listens. Thank you to my wife for being in some early episodes. I won't hold it against you that you no longer want to do it with me. And thank you for doing things like submitting questions and suggesting topics and guests. I just love hearing from you. You can always reach out via the Deep Thoughts Instagram. Thank you for listening to Deep Thoughts. I really, truly hope it helps you in fostering deep faith. Hey.